Every traditional QC program has a blind spot built into its design. It monitors a bottled control material at scheduled intervals, every 8 hours, every batch, which means an analytical error that starts and ends between two QC events can slip through completely undetected, silently affecting every patient result in that window. There's a second, deeper problem beneath the timing gap: commutability. QC material, lyophilized, stabilized, chemically processed, doesn't always behave identically to real human serum inside every assay's chemistry, particularly on immunoassay platforms, where matrix effects can make bottled control material respond differently than a real patient specimen would. The practical consequence is uncomfortable but well documented. A QC material can sail through every Westgard rule in the book, while an assay is genuinely miscalibrated for real patient specimens, because the control material's matrix simply doesn't expose the same interference the patient's serum does. So the founding question behind this entire field is deceptively simple. What if, instead of relying only on artificial control material, you used the flood of real patient results already streaming off the analyzer, every minute of every shift, as an additional, continuous monitoring signal? That's the entire premise of patient-based real-time quality control, or PBRTQC. Applying statistical process control not to a bottled reference material, but to the moving central tendency of consecutive patient results themselves, continuously, with every single result, not just at scheduled QC intervals. The advantages stack up quickly once you see the concept. True commutability, since the signal is literally made of real patient specimens. Continuous coverage with no blind gap between checks, zero material cost, and detection of errors specific to certain patient populations that generic control material was never designed to reveal. This isn't a fringe idea anymore. The International Federation of Clinical Chemistry formed a dedicated working group on PBRTQC, publishing formal consensus recommendations, and modern laboratory informatics finally makes the continuous real-time computation this method demands genuinely practical at scale. None of this replaces traditional QC outright. That distinction matters, and we'll return to it. But understanding exactly how a laboratory turns a raw stream of patient numbers into a working quality signal is where any serious technical grasp of this method has to begin. At its mechanical core, PBRTQC takes a rolling window of the most recent n consecutive patient results for one analyte, calculates a single summary statistic from that window, typically a mean, median, or weighted average, and watches that number for a shift, updating with every new result that comes in. Before any averaging happens, though, raw patient results almost always pass through a truncation step first. Results outside a defined range, genuinely sick patients with pathological values, get excluded from the calculation entirely, so the moving statistic reflects analytical stability, not the ordinary clinical variability of who happened to get tested. Sodium makes the logic vivid. An inpatient population might genuinely range from 115 to 165 mol, or L due to real pathology, but truncating to roughly 130 to 150 mol, or L before averaging, keeps the moving statistic dominated by the large, stable bulk of near-normal results. Exactly the population most sensitive to a small analytical shift. The simplest statistic to track is a straight moving average. Sum the truncated window's values, divide by n, exactly like any arithmetic mean, while a moving median swaps in the middle value instead, trading a small amount of statistical efficiency for genuine resistance to any single outlier that slipped past truncation. A more responsive alternative borrows directly from the EWMA concept covered in baseline QC design. Instead of weighting every point in the window equally, an exponentially weighted moving average gives the newest patient result the most influence, letting the statistic react to a genuine shift faster than a flat moving average ever could. Block size, n, is the single most consequential design decision in the whole system. A small n reacts fast, but swings with ordinary patient-to-patient biological variation, throwing false alarms. A large n smooths that noise away, but takes far longer, meaning far more patients, to register a genuine analytical shift. Plotted against real data, the difference is visually obvious. A small n moving average line jitters constantly around the true value even when nothing is analytically wrong, while a large n line stays glassy smooth, but takes visibly longer to bend once a genuine shift is deliberately introduced into the same dataset. So the mechanical skeleton is genuinely simple: truncate, window, average, compare. The real sophistication in this field lives entirely in how those three parameters get chosen, which is exactly the kind of design problem generations of laboratory scientists have spent decades refining. This field didn't begin with sophisticated informatics. It began in 1974 in hematology, with a statistician named Brian Bull noticing something remarkable about red blood cell indices that would quietly launch an entire discipline decades before anyone called it patient-based real-time QC. Bull's key insight was specific to red cell indices, MCV, MCH, MCHC, which stay remarkably stable across an entire hospital population regardless of who's actually being tested that day, because red cell size and hemoglobin content per cell don't vary nearly as wildly across patients as, say, glucose or creatinine do. Bull's method calculates a truncated mean of MCV, MCH, and MCHC across a moving block of patient results, typically 20 consecutive samples. And because these indices vary so little between a genuinely healthy population and a hospital's actual sick population, the truncated mean stays tight enough to flag even a modest calibration drift. A decade later, George Cembrowski and colleagues formalized a parallel idea for general clinical chemistry: the average of normals, or AON, applying the same truncate and average logic to routine chemistry analytes like calcium, glucose, and electrolytes, laying much of the statistical groundwork modern PBRTQC still builds on. For decades, the concept genuinely outran the technology available to run it. Calculating a true moving average across thousands of daily results, continuously, by hand or with 1980s computing power, simply wasn't realistic for routine use, which kept PBRTQC as a mostly academic idea for a surprisingly long stretch. That changed decisively in the 2010s. Modern laboratory information systems and dedicated middleware platforms can now calculate moving statistics across every analyte, in real time, updating with literally every result. The exact continuous computation the original 1970s and 1980s concept always needed but never had. That technological catch-up is precisely what enabled the IFCC to convene its working group on PBRTQC, pulling together researchers and practicing laboratory scientists to formally standardize terminology, evaluate the competing algorithms, and publish consensus guidance for labs implementing this method for the first time. 50 years separate Bull's original hematology insight from today's fully computational, IFCC-guided implementations, but the underlying statistical logic barely changed at all. What changed was the field finally gaining the computing power and the formal guidance to run that logic continuously, at scale. Building a working PBRTQC algorithm for a real analyte means making 4 sequential design decisions, in order, each one constraining the choices available for the next. Get the sequence wrong, and even a mathematically correct algorithm can end up practically useless. Truncation limits should not be set arbitrarily. The defensible approach anchors them to the analyte's own population distribution, typically excluding roughly the outer 5 to 10% of results on each tail, keeping the calculation centered on the dense, stable bulk where genuine analytical drift is most detectable. Get truncation wrong in either direction and the algorithm fails differently. Too narrow, and you throw away so many legitimate results that block size n takes far too long to fill, delaying detection. Too wide, and pathological values leak back in, adding clinical noise that masks the very analytical shift you're trying to catch. Analyte choice matters enormously here too. Not every test is a good PBRTQC candidate. High volume, tightly distributed analytes like sodium, calcium, or hemoglobin are ideal. Low volume or highly skewed analytes, where the normal population is a small minority of all results tested, make truncation and block size selection far harder to get right. Control limits, the final piece, are typically expressed not in raw concentration units, but in standard deviations of the moving statistic itself, meaning the limits have to be empirically derived from that specific analyte's own historical PBRTQC data, not borrowed from a textbook table or another lab's chart. A worked calcium example ties all 4 decisions together. Population truncated to 8.0 to 10.5 milligrams or DL, block size N of 50 consecutive results, moving average as the statistic, and control limits set at plus or minus 0.15 milligrams or DL around the established target. A complete, defensible, for part algorithm specification. None of these four parameters should be set once and forgotten. Either analyte reagent formulations change, patient case mix shifts over years, and instruments age, meaning a mature PBRTQC program periodically revisits and revalidates its truncation limits, block size, and control limits against fresh historical data. For decisions made deliberately and revisited periodically are what separate a genuinely useful PBRTQC algorithm from a mathematically elegant one that quietly underperforms in practice. The next question is how you actually prove, with numbers, that a given specification works well enough to trust. Every PBRTQC algorithm gets judged against one central performance metric: the number of patient results, or NPR. How many consecutive patient samples, on average, pass through the analyzer before a systematic error of a given size actually triggers an alarm. Quick pause. If this breakdown is helping you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely takes a lot of effort to make videos like this, and your support keeps them coming. Lower NPR is always better for patient safety, but it isn't free. Squeezing NPR down by shrinking block size or tightening control limits directly trades away false alarm tolerance, since a more sensitive algorithm inevitably reacts to more ordinary statistical noise along with any genuine shift. A work comparison makes the trade-off concrete. For a 2-mol or L systematic sodium bias, a tightly tuned algorithm might achieve an NPR of roughly 40, meaning only 40 patients get exposed before detection, while a loosely tuned version of the same algorithm might not trigger until NPR reaches 150 or more. The uncomfortable part of NPR is that it isn't a single fixed number for any algorithm. It changes depending on the size of the error you're asking about. The same algorithm might show an NPR of 30 for a large 5-mol or L bias, but an NPR well over 300 for a subtle 1-mol or L bias. This is exactly why NPR always has to be reported against a specific, clinically meaningful bias, usually derived from that analyte's allowable total error or biological variation database, rather than as a single generic performance number that doesn't actually say what error size it's promising to catch. Modern algorithm design has largely stopped guessing at these trade-offs and started simulating them instead. Labs run thousands of simulated patient result streams, deliberately injecting known biases of varying sizes, and empirically measure the resulting NPR across a whole grid of candidate block sizes and control limits before choosing a final specification. The target NPR itself should be anchored to something clinically real, commonly the size of bias that would meaningfully affect a clinical decision for that specific analyte, tying the entire statistical exercise back to actual patient impact rather than pure mathematical elegance for its own sake. NPR turns "is this algorithm good?" from a subjective impression into a specific, testable, simulation-derived number. Exactly the kind of rigor that separates a properly validated PBRTQC program from one that simply looks reasonable on paper but was never actually stress-tested against a real bias. PBRTQC's greatest strength is also its greatest vulnerability, because the signal comes from real patients rather than a controlled artificial material. Anything that genuinely shifts the patient population itself can mimic or mask an analytical error, and telling the two apart is where real expertise lies. Case mix is the most common confounder. A weekday hospital population, dense with scheduled surgical and outpatient testing, looks statistically different from a weekend or overnight population, which skews more heavily toward emergency and ICU admissions. A real, expected, entirely non-analytical shift in the moving average. Plotted over a full week, this creates a visible, cyclical wobble in the moving average that has absolutely nothing to do with instrument performance. A pattern experienced PBRTQC teams learn to recognize by its rhythm alone, since it repeats predictably rather than drifting in one steady direction. The practical countermeasure is to build the expected pattern into the algorithm itself. Separate control limits or separate baseline targets for weekday versus weekend populations, or for distinct patient care areas entirely, so a real cyclical case mix shift stops masquerading as an analytical problem. A second, subtler confounder is seasonal disease prevalence. an analyte tied to a seasonal condition can show genuine population-level shifts over months, not weeks, that a short-window algorithm won't catch as a pattern at all, since the change unfolds too gradually relative to the block size being monitored. The failure mode runs in both directions, which is exactly what makes this genuinely difficult. An algorithm poorly designed to handle case mix can throw false alarms constantly during known population shifts, which teaches technologists to reflexively dismiss PBRTQC alerts, precisely the habit that lets a real error slip through unnoticed. This is precisely why the IFCC's guidance emphasizes validating any PBRTQC algorithm against a full year, not a few weeks, of that specific lab's own historical data, long enough to capture weekday or weekend cycles, seasonal patterns, and any other recurring, non-analytical population rhythm unique to that patient population. None of these confounders are arguments against PBRTQC. They're arguments for designing it carefully. A well-built algorithm that accounts for real population rhythm is a genuinely powerful tool. A naively built one becomes a source of noise nobody trusts within a few months. Let's walk one analyte through a complete, real implementation from first principles to a live alert. Creatinine, chosen specifically because its genuinely skewed population distribution makes it a harder, more realistic test of the design process than a tidy, symmetric analyte would be. Step 1. Characterize the population. A full year of this lab's creatinine results shows a heavily right-skewed distribution. A large cluster of healthy results between 0.6 and 1.1 milligrams or DL, with a long tail extending past 5 milligrams or DL from renal-impaired inpatients. Exactly the skew that makes a simple mean a poor choice here. Given that skew, the design team chooses a moving median rather than a moving mean. The median resists being dragged upward by the long tail of renal-impaired patients far better than an arithmetic average would, staying centered on the dense healthy cluster where analytical drift is most detectable. Truncation limits get set at 0.5 to 1.8 milligrams or DL, capturing the healthy cluster plus mild elevation, while excluding frank renal impairment entirely, and block size is set to n equals 75, balancing this lab's moderate daily creatinine volume against the noise reduction a right-skewed analyte specifically needs. Simulation against a full year of this lab's own historical data, with a deliberately injected 0.2 milligrams or DL systematic bias, produces an NPR of approximately 65, meaning roughly 65 patients would be exposed before the algorithm reliably flags that specific bias, a number the lab formally documents as the validated performance target. Go live doesn't happen overnight, either. The algorithm runs in a silent shadow mode for a further 60 to 90 days, generating alerts that get logged and reviewed but never actually acted upon operationally. A final real-world check that the simulation-derived parameters behave as expected against genuinely new data. Once live, an actual alert triggers a specific, predefined response protocol. Not a panicked instrument shutdown, but a structured check. Review recent QC material results. Check the maintenance log, and only escalate to instrument troubleshooting once those first 2 steps fail to explain the signal. From population characterization to a documented go-live protocol, every step traces back to real data from this specific lab, this specific analyte, and this specific patient population. Exactly the deliberate, evidence-based process that separates a trustworthy PBRTQC program from a borrowed template that happens to compile. Despite everything covered so far, current IFCC guidance is explicit on one point. PBRTQC is designed to complement traditional external QC, not replace it outright, and understanding exactly why draws a clean line between what each method can and can't see. Traditional QC still does something PBRTQC structurally cannot: verify accuracy against a known, assigned, traceable value. PBRTQC only ever detects that something changed relative to the lab's own recent history. It has no external anchor telling it whether today's baseline itself was ever truly correct in the first place. This is precisely why the two methods sit side by side in a mature QC program rather than competing for the same job. Traditional QC anchors the system to a known truth at scheduled intervals, while PBRTQC watches the continuous space between those intervals for anything traditional QC's schedule alone would miss. Where PBRTQC genuinely earns its keep as more than a supplement is in situations traditional QC structurally struggles with: point-of-care devices where control material is expensive and inconvenient, immunoassays with known commutability problems, and high-volume analytes tested continuously around the clock. Regulatory and accreditation bodies have started to take formal notice too. Some jurisdictions now permit reduced-frequency traditional QC, specifically when a validated PBRTQC program runs alongside it, recognizing that the two together provide equal or better error detection than either alone. The field is still actively moving. 2. Machine learning approaches to dynamically adjust truncation limits and block size in real time, rather than fixing them at validation, represent the current frontier of PBRTQC research, promising algorithms that adapt to population shifts instead of merely tolerating them. For any lab considering this technically demanding but genuinely powerful method, the honest starting checklist is short. Confirm your LIS or middleware can actually compute moving statistics in real time. Pick one high-volume analyte to pilot, and commit to the full year of shadow mode validation before a single alert becomes actionable. From Bull's 1974 insight about stable red cell indices to today's IFCC-guided, simulation-optimized, real-time algorithms, the core idea never changed. Your patients are already telling you, continuously, whether your analyzer is working. This entire discipline is simply the discipline of learning to listen correctly. Here are the key references and sources for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped, like the video and subscribe for more clear, simple explainers, and I'll see you in the next one.